I could do a 1 hour live stream of not just about Thomas Jefferson, but about this book about Thomas Jefferson. Let me put it this way. Have you heard in the newspapers in the last 5 years something controversial and interesting with Thomas Jefferson? If so, what would it be? You could just use one word. You just use, like, you don't have to write out a whole sentence or whatever. If I were to ask you, the 25 people who are in the audience now, what is the one thing you've heard about Thomas Jefferson in the last 5 years? What's the one thing? There are also quite a few books I have been reading that I may wish to comment on to some extent. And by the way, I'll be the first to do it. Many of the books I want to talk about, I have not finished reading. There's one thing I learned, honestly, in more than 5 years of being on YouTube. What am I up to? 7 years? Some of that. Okay. Something I've learned in many years on YouTube, you know, you're better off doing the book review when you're halfway through the book. Really, try it. Try doing 1,000 YouTube videos and then tell me I'm wrong. You know, and by the way, if you change your mind later, do another video when you're finished the book with further thoughts or what have you. But normally, most of your feelings and thoughts and what you want to talk about is going to be before you complete the book. And in case you don't know me, in case we've never met before, welcome to the show. But you know, I've been reading an extraordinary amount about the period in between the American Revolution and the writing of the Constitution. Just a lot of people don't realize that there's a really significant period of history between the Declaration of Independence and the American Constitution. And it's a period in which anything could have happened and history would have been changed forever after, not just the United States, but the whole world. And only very certain peculiar things did happen. So in terms of just drawing a division between secular and religious fanatic, you know, Thomas Jefferson, that's the reason why Hitchens is writing this ridiculous book flattering Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is on the secular free-thinking side. Was he an atheist? No, not quite. He was on the spectrum. He was on the atheist spectrum, we might say, right? And, you know, again, certainly someone like Gouverneur Morris, an effete aristocrat, living in wealth and luxury and, you know, so on and so forth. He was a free thinker, and if not an outright atheist, he was again on the spectrum. And these were people, you or I, if we got into a time machine and traveled back in time, you could sit and have a delightful lunch or dinner with Gouverneur Morris or Thomas Jefferson. They're also morally despicable people. Now, puritanical religious leaders like Herman Husband, whether they identified as Quaker or as one of the myriad sects. So again, most people didn't actually call themselves Puritan. I mean, it's kind of retrospectively in history, we look back and say these people were Puritans. But you're talking about sort of a mixed bag of different Protestant fundamentalists, eccentric evangelical, you know, religious movements who call themselves all kinds of things. But, you know, this type of strident Christian extremist revolutionary, you would not be able to eat lunch with. In the time of the American Revolution itself, and then in the struggles that continued after the revolution, because again, for some people, the revolution didn't stop. And Herman Husband keeps on fighting all the way through to what's called the Whiskey Rebellion, or the Whiskey Rebellion period, the period of Whiskey Rebellions, plural. That's after the writing of the Constitution. There were poor people suffering under unfair and oppressive taxes to an unbelievable extent. And the taxes after the American Revolution were much worse than they had been before the American Revolution. Now, I'm not going to digress into explaining why and how that was. I do know, though, it's not mysterious, but it's technical and complex. So, you know, and indeed, it's just worth asking. Like, if you were explaining this to a 12-year-old kid, they might say, oh, but I thought the whole reason these guys went out and fought the revolution was because they felt they were paying taxes that were too high. Then after the revolution, the taxes are way too high. Yeah, we'll tell Herman Husband about it. So he got his gun and he went back to war. I mean, he remained at a state of war or siege with the, you know, supposedly democratic government of the new United States of America. And he also felt, and again, I think most people would say correctly, that the newly created government was not particularly democratic and was not particularly egalitarian. Bringing this full circle back to what I mentioned at the beginning, why do you think the government was not particularly democratic? Why do you think it was not particularly egalitarian? Because that government was created by and for people like Gouverneur Morris, John Adams, and yes, y'all, Thomas Jefferson. I mean, if Thomas Jefferson was not an aristocrat in the strictest sense of the term, who was? When you picture in your mind's eye an aristocrat, Thomas Jefferson visiting Paris in his, 18th century, culotte, in his silk, and his ermine and his mail, accompanied by his slaves. Thomas Jefferson was an aristocrat. I can't even say in all but name. He was an aristocrat in every possible meaningful sense of the word. And he was received in Paris as an aristocrat by other aristocrats. He was a land-owning, slave-driving aristocrat. Now, some people say that Thomas Jefferson, when he was in Paris, started having sex with his 16-year-old black slave. That's grossly misleading. According to this book, she was 14 at the time. I do not know what motivates people like Christopher Hitchens to write propaganda of this kind, but the book really is propaganda. It's this kind of awful, shameful, shoddy, dishonest rewriting of history. I really do not sympathize with Christopher Hitchens in writing this book at all. It's poorly written. I mean, it's not the quality. How shall I say this? The quality of writing is patchy. Which was, it's not consistently terrible, but yeah, but like maybe one sentence out of 8, I say out loud, that was really badly written. You know what I mean? It's not swinging for the fences. But obviously the style is not the most important problem here. And he still does this really teenage thing of trying to show off that he knows words you don't know. So I think for you, maybe there have been 5 words that were not in your vocabulary, words you have never seen in the English language at all. For me, I think it was maybe just one word, but I have an unusual vocabulary. Unusual is a good word for my book, but yeah, not a humble brag, but yeah, but even then, the other words that I knew the meaning of and you didn't, I was just laughing out loud. I was like, oh, well, Melissa, how could you possibly not know and use this word in everyday conversation? It's just ludicrously obscure vocabulary thrown in for no reason. This is the least of the book's problems. All right. So there was a 14-year-old girl was sent across the Atlantic in 1787 to join Thomas Jefferson in Paris. So Thomas Jefferson is on a diplomatic mission in Paris, and this slave girl is sent to him. Now, according to this book, she's 14 at the time. Other sources claim 15 or 16. You can imagine reasons why some people might want to round up. The first clue to the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and this 14-year-old black slave girl, the first clue to the relationship may lie in the simple fact that Jefferson, having met Sally and received his daughter from her in good condition, did not send her home again, as he had planned to do with the original escort. He did not require an extra service at the Hôtel de Langeac, his well-appointed residence, where Sally's brother James was already on the staff, being trained as a French chef. So her brother James, you realize, is also a black American slave. And in France, actually, their slave contract is null and void. These slaves would have the right to run away or even sue their slave masters. So he's in a bit of a dangerous position bringing his black American slaves to France. Under these conditions, possibly the latter consideration influenced him in inviting Sally to stay on. Now, I know for some of you, it may not be striking how dishonest it is. Yes, possibly the fact that her brother was there training to be a chef. She was pregnant immediately after her arrival in Paris. Oh, yes, well, it's certainly interesting that he decided not to send her back. Perhaps it's because her brother was studying to be a chef. Who would write this? Sorry, I'm going to say who would write this in 2021. Obviously, this is written a few years ago, but I could get the date. What was the date of first publication of this? Sorry, it's not ancient history, guys. But, okay. So this was 2005. This was written in. What is the point of writing a book that's going to deal with Thomas Jefferson's sex life if you can't really be honest with it? You know what I mean? So, by the way, shout out to several people in the audience who knew what I was hinting at. Answers to my question. Rich DeBeefin said, quote, he was sexually open-minded. Nacho, who to us is known as Nachette, said that he had an affair with his slave. So, yes. In 1788, Jefferson began to pay wages to her and to her brother, James, although he had never paid James a regular wage before. Moreover, slavery was not recognized as legal on French soil, a fact of which Jefferson was aware, and one that it would not have taken Sally long to find out. Oh, yes, a 14-year-old with absolutely no education would certainly be in a position to exercise her legal rights. She could have run away, but I mean, in a country where she doesn't speak the language, I mean, why would anyone presume she is illiterate in any language? 14-year-old slave, raised very literally on a slave plantation in Virginia. Jefferson and Hemings did not have a master-slave relationship in the vile sense that is normally understood. Period. No footnote. No footnote, no parentheses. This is actually the end of the paragraph. So he ends a paragraph saying, Jefferson and Hemings did not have a master-slave relationship in the vile sense that is normally understood. 2005, Christopher Hitchens publishes. Christopher Hitchens, not a genius. Quote, most historians until recently took the view that a sexual liaison was literally unthinkable. Certainly unthinkable in the sense that historians barely thought about it for two reasons. The first was the revulsion that it is simply assumed Jefferson must have felt, either for any carnal knowledge of a slave or, depending upon the prejudices of the historian, any carnal knowledge of a black woman. Now, this is even more bizarre because Melissa and I know where this is going next. Hitchens is going to, so the author of this book, is going to proceed to argue that Sally Hemings, his black slave, should not be considered black at all, that she was not black, that really she was white. Totally. So you're saying, you're commenting that some historians are prejudiced in that they can't believe Thomas Jefferson would be attracted to a black woman, and then you proceed to argue that this woman was not black. In the case of Dumas Malone, whose enormous hagiography of Jefferson has been standard for far too long, one suspects that the historian had great difficulty considering the question of carnal knowledge at all. So here we go. Here come the excuses. In status, Sally was barely a slave. What is that supposed to mean? What is that supposed to mean? So, by the way, if you guys don't know, Christopher Hitchens, let me just disclose, ethnically, I am considered Jewish. Now, in fact, I am only half Jewish, but politically, I'm considered Jewish, right? Barack Obama, ethnically, he's half black and half white. Nobody ever refers to Barack Obama as white, right? His political status in this society is his identity is being a black person. Okay, what was Christopher Hitchens' ethnic identity? He chose to identify as Jewish, and he was not even 5% Jewish. He had one incredibly remote Jewish ancestor. Nobody in his family identified as Jewish. His own brother, who was further to the right politically than him, was more conservative than him. His own brother repeatedly publicly denounced him for this and said, in our family, nobody was raised Jewish. His brother said that he doesn't identify as Jewish, that their own father and mother were in no way Jewish, that neither culturally they were not Jewish at all. He didn't deny that. If you went back and researched the family tree far enough, there was this one remote ancestor who was Jewish, but like, guess what? If you go back far enough, we all come from Africa, you know? So Chris Hitchens, how is it possible that Christopher Hitchens chooses to identify as Jewish on the basis of a tiny fragment of his DNA? He went his whole life long at speeches, charismatically telling the crowd that he identified as a Jewish atheist. That was his identity, his whole life. How is that possible? And he looks at the life of a 14-year-old black slave from the American South, Virginia specifically, state of Virginia. And he says, oh, well, this person wasn't really a slave and wasn't really black. And her relationship with her slave master, who got her pregnant 6 times, starting at age 14, wasn't really slavery. This is Chris Hitchens in 2005. He was not a young man in 2005. Alexa, in what year was Christopher Hitchens born?
Christopher Hitchens was born on April 13th, 1949.
He was born in 1949. So his age in 2005 was old. Okay, he was officially old. he was too old. What? That's old. You were old. You were old enough to know about the birds and the bees, and you were old enough to know about the blacks and the whites. I mean, you were old enough to know racism. If he was 18 years old or 21 years old, he'd be like, well, kid, you got some things to learn about racism in Virginia. Like, guess what? Still today in Virginia, if you are 1/4 black and 3/4 white, your political identity is black. But back in the 1770s through the 1790s, let me tell you something. If you were 1/4 black or 1/8 black in Virginia, like, are you kidding? Is it really plausible that Christopher Hitchens is this ignorant or this stupid? Okay, so he is claiming, we continue our quotation, quote, in status, Sally was barely a slave, and reckoning by, quote, race, unquote, she was by descent and in appearance very nearly white. This is Christopher Hitchens. How could you be so blind? It's just ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. He's spent time in America. I mean, I know he's British, but still, I mean, he's well traveled, especially with the United States of America. But like, in a lot of these countries, whether it's America, Brazil, Mexico, the Caribbean, like, are you kidding? Jefferson was later to compose an insanely complicated ethnographical diagram to show how, after a certain number of crossings between a black person and a white person, this is a quotation. Okay, YouTube, I am quoting a book. I'm going to hold up the book. After a certain number of crossings, the taint of Africa was removed. His words, not mine. Sally was a quote-unquote quadroon, and both she and 3 of her sons, the only slaves Jefferson ever freed, were able to register as white in the census of 1830. Most of this, so this is his claim. I find this baffling. Most of their descendants continue to live on the white side of what is still America's most hazardous frontier, which surely qualifies Sally Hemings, whose grave now lies somewhere under the parking lot of the Hampton Inn in Charlottesville, as one of the Republic's founding mothers. So there are a series of bizarre and impossible to support claims there from Christopher Hitchens. The first is the claim that Thomas Jefferson's slave wasn't really his slave. The second, that she wasn't really black. Like, what? Why? What do you have to gain by telling this lie? It's just mind-blowing to me.